In the summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room. I was working on some schoolwork, and my brother and boyfriend were playing a video game in the next room. They were gracious enough to keep the volume down so that I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered that I needed to put some gas in my car. Finishing the last paragraph of my essay, I called my parents to let them know that I would be gone for a few minutes, but that I was coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes from my house, so I would have been back in about 20 minutes or so. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left without another word. After 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the gas station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started pumping gas into my car, an old beat-up pickup truck appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and noticed two dark figures just sitting there. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but they seemed to be talking while checking out the place. I brushed it off and finished filling my tank. Before I got back into my car, I decided to run into the building to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I then walked inside and quickly picked out some items. Just as I was done making my purchase, two men wearing jeans with black hoodies burst into the store, guns drawn. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-20s and fairly built. "Everybody get on the ground!" the first man shouted. The cashier and everyone else in the store immediately obeyed his orders. There was a few panicked whispers until one of the men shouted at them to shut up. I felt my heart pick up its pace, and my blood ran cold. These men were about to rob this place and possibly shoot up the customers or the cashier. I prayed silently to myself that no one would be killed or seriously injured. One of the men grabbed my hair. "You, stand," he commanded. Fearing for my life, I did as he ordered. Almost immediately, I felt an arm snake around my wrist and take hold. I would have elbowed him, stomped his foot, or attempted to punch his face, but I was so paralyzed in fear to think or do anything. The worst part, I felt a gun aiming at the back of my head. I tried squirming away from the man's grip, but he just held me tighter and hissed at me. "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man shouted at the cashier. "Hand over the cash, or you're gonna be scraping this bitch's brains off the wall." I had no connection with the cashier in any way, except for just being a customer at the store, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he wanted to protect me in any way he could. He was an older guy, possibly in his 60s, with glasses on his face. I knew that he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He hastily unlocked the register. As he was handing over the cash, I felt the barrel of the gun press against the side of my head, and I nearly started to freak out. I restrained myself and just started to tear up a little. My throat burned from holding it back, all for the sake of keeping myself alive for as long as possible. Once every last dollar bill was in the man's hands, sirens blared from outside. The man then stuffed the money into a backpack, then punched out the cashier. I was then thrown to the side, my stomach and arm hitting the edge of the counter before I fell onto the floor. As soon as the two men ran outside, they were surrounded by police. Within seconds, they were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still catching my breath, but I was more concerned about the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. For the most part, he seemed okay, although I could see his right eye was turning black. His glasses laid broken on the floor. "Are you all right, sir?" I weakly asked him, my stomach still hurting. "I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be okay," he responded. "Is everyone all right?" a familiar voice asked. One of the cops, who is also very good friends with my father, had entered the store. "Just us two might need some attention," I said. The officer turned towards us. He immediately recognized me and asked if I was okay. The cashier and I told him everything, as other cops eventually came in and questioned the other customers. It turns out that a customer had sneaked into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning had finished, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, not because I was in pain, but because I had just endured the scariest moment of my life. I just wanted to get home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was rushed out of the store on a stretcher. "Do you need any medical attention?" the officer asked. I shook my head and cried, "I just want to go home." As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few cops investigating the truck I had seen earlier. And then it clicked in my head. That vehicle belonged to the two men. They had been scoping out the place, waiting for the right time to strike. And I was pretty sure that I was the first person they saw to use as bait. A police car followed me home that night. Eventually we came to my neighborhood. My mom rushed out of the house and embraced me in her arms. She kept asking me what happened, but I could hardly speak because I was crying so much. Once I was inside, my boyfriend saw me and wrapped me around his arms and held me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained what happened at the gas station. After the cops left, I was lying on the couch watching TV with an ice pack on my stomach. My brother came in and asked me what happened, but I knew that he had to go to bed soon, so I promised I would tell him in the morning. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, and I didn't want to scare him. I then made a promise to myself that I would never go certain places at night ever again. A couple of years ago, there was reports of a woman being attacked in my area. This was shocking because my community had recently gotten rid of a bunch of drug dealers who operated in my neighborhood, and the gang activity connected to that had died down significantly. We were all looking forward to living in a clean, peaceful neighborhood for a while. No such luck. I lived in an apartment building and was about 17 at the time. The attack on the woman was brutal. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten unconscious. Over the next few months, this happened to at least a dozen other women. Not much details were released to the press. I'm guessing the victims were too frightened to speak publicly about their encounters. Luckily, they all survived. However, none of them were able to give an accurate description of the perpetrator, as the attacker would usually sneak up from behind, in the dark. All of them were attacked while they were walking home from work. This meant that the assailant most likely watched these women and became familiar with their routines before making his move. Everyone was on edge. You could even see it in the streets. Husbands and fathers would hurry their families indoors as soon as the sun started going down. Children were not allowed to play outside after dark, and it was winter at the time, so the sun went down rather early. As soon as it got dark, the streets were dead. One day, my grandmother came to visit us. My mother had come down with a bad case of the flu. My grandmother spent the day at our place, and I guess we all chatted for a bit too long. By the time she was ready to leave, it was completely dark outside, and it felt wrong to let my grandmother go out on her own. My mom obviously wasn't feeling well, so I, being the stupid brave teenager I was, said that I would walk with Grandma to the bus stop. I was 5'2", not the ideal bodyguard, but come on. Would any of you let your grandma walk the streets alone with a serial rapist on the loose? We got to the station just fine, and I waved my grandma goodbye as her bus departed. There was a crowd of people who had gotten off the bus before my grandma boarded. After the bus was out of sight, I suddenly felt like I was being watched, and I turned around quickly. As I did, I looked straight at a dark figure who was standing under a lamppost that was just down the street from the bus stop. I froze, shocked. The recent attacks had been in the back of my mind all night, and here I was, practically by myself, staring down a dark, creepy figure that was standing under a streetlight. I suddenly broke into a run and caught up with the small crowd of people that had gotten off the bus. I ran through the crowd and sprinted home, looking behind me every 5 seconds. I was in hysterics by the time I reached my apartment building. Now, hear me out, guys. I know that nothing technically happened to me, but I was scared out of my wits. So I figured that I would call the non-emergency number for the police, just to let them know that there was a suspicious man standing outside the bus stop. Couldn't hurt, right? A while after I reported it, an officer called me back. I gave them my number when I made my initial report. They were really looking for this guy, so they made it a point to follow up on any possible leads. They got the man's full description by reversing the footage from the bus stop's security camera, and his appearance was an exact match to what one of the victims had described. A couple of days later, I learned from a local news report that they arrested someone in connection with the attacks. On the night before I saw him at the bus stop, he had apparently almost killed a female beat cop who was patrolling around an area where one of the attacks had taken place. He attacked her from behind and nearly beat her to death with a crowbar. Luckily, the lady survived, but I think that was one of the reasons why the police were so hell-bent on catching him. I've learned one more thing since his arrest. He had apparently been there at the bus stop to look out for more potential victims. Thank God I called the police that night on purely a hunch. I like to think that I contributed to the arrest of a very dangerous man. Hopefully he spends the rest of his days behind bars, where animals like him belong. This happened when I was 9 years old in 1987. I grew up in Townsend, Massachusetts. It's a medium-sized town on the New Hampshire border. My dad worked for a very well-known local plastics company, and my stepmom worked at the Congregational Church. I got dragged along with his wife to church every Sunday, whether I wanted to or not. The one saving grace of going to church with my dad's wife was the opportunity to go on the playground after Sunday school class and the standing offer of cake, which they had almost every Sunday. It was one Sunday in late November. I was dragged to church with my dad's wife. Afterwards, as usual, me and the rest of the kids from class poured into the churchyard to socialize and drop cake everywhere. Now, I don't really remember what prompted me to approach a girl named Abby. She was 2 years younger than me, and a lot more popular. She was somebody that I barely knew, and hardly ever spoke to. But still, something within me told me that I had to tell her something important. So I sought her out on the playground that morning. "Hey, Abby," I started, feeling driven by something I couldn't explain. "You have to grow your fingernails out, so if someone tries to hurt you, you can go right for their eyes." I was dead serious as I said this. She gave me a slightly confused look and said, "Okay, why?" I didn't have an answer to that, so I just kind of shrugged and told her, "Just do it, okay? Trust me." A week later, she, her younger brother, and their mom would be found dead, murdered by a neighborhood psychopath named Daniel LaPlante. He had broken into their home, shot and killed Abby's mother Priscilla, and then drowned Abby and her brother William. He managed to hide from the police for at least 2 days, eventually being captured a half-hour away in the town of Ayer. When he was arrested, the police noticed scratches around his eyes. I cried when I found out that she and her family had been brutally murdered. I finally understood why I had to warn her, but still could not explain how I knew. Regardless, I view it as a failure on my part. I remember being incredibly distraught about it. No 9-year-old should have that kind of burden or guilt. I feel awful about what happened to Abby and her family, and I wish I could have done more to save her life. It took me years to mentally accept what happened. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing, but I was just too young to fully understand. There's always a reason to be afraid.